And thank you to everyone who is chiming in on the chat. Please continue to do so and let us know you're here and where you're coming from. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you to our Pride Month webinar today, Pride in Myself. My name is Schroeder Stribling. I'm President and CEO at Mental Health America, and I am really honored and excited to be moderating today's panel discussion. So I have a few notes for you before I say a few words and introduce our speakers. This webinar is being recorded, and all registrants will receive an email with the recording within 1 week. We do not currently offer CEUs, but if you would like a certificate of attendance, we do have a form for you to request, and we're going to post the link to that form in the chat shortly. It will also be included in the follow-up email, so stay tuned for that. So once again, happy Pride Month, everyone. Pride Month is time for LGBTQ folks, community, and allies to gather and to celebrate. And I just want to say, as we kick this off, that throughout my lifetime, I have personally appreciated the meaning of pride and its parades and its celebrations. I grew up in New York in the 1970s, and in addition to being queer myself, I had a gay parent, my father, and so I remember even the early days of pride parades, the smaller parades that we had in those times, and it's wonderful to have those memories. And this Pride Month seems a particularly poignant time, however, because as we know, our community is under attack in so many ways and in so many places, and our young people are especially vulnerable to the negative mental health impact of this. There's no doubt that in my lifetime, we've made remarkable strides. We've gone from the time of Stonewall to legal marriage. That's certainly an awful lot of progress. And we have a long ways to go. We've got to fight back against this new wave of attacks. And I'm sure many of you have seen that HRC, the Human Rights Campaign, declared a state of emergency for the LGBTQ community this week. I also think as a community, we have our own internal work to do in being more inclusive and responsive with BIPOC, LGBTQ folks and intersectional identity communities. With all of that said, however, I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and we have terrific panelists here with us to talk about Pride Month 23. So without further ado, let me introduce them to you. Casey Tanner is the founder and CEO of the Expansive Group, a gender and sex therapy startup that now serves over 1,000 sex therapy clients annually. They are the co-host of Safe Word, a top 1% podcast in 2022. Casey is a global thought leader in millennial and Gen Z relationships, gender, and sexuality, and teaches to a combined audience of over 300,000 on their Instagram and TikTok at Queer Sex Therapy. Tanner recently won the AASECT 2023 Rising Star Award for being an emergent leader in the field of sex therapy. Dr. LaNail Plummer is a leading professional in the mental health field, and along with her team of 30 all-Black women of color, is committed to improving the lifestyles of others through the aspects of mental health and character development. She is a proud Howard University graduate and an active member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, a U.S. military veteran, and CEO of Onyx Therapy Group, an organization she founded in 2013. Plummer has 18 years of experience working with a multitude of clients and specializing in the care of young women, the Black community, and members of the LGBTQ community. Her work and expertise have been featured in Essence, NBC, Forbes, The Washingtonian, and Time Magazine, among others, and she has spoken at conferences during the Essence Fest and for Mental Health America, New York University, and the U.S. Black Chamber of Commerce. Patrick Custer is a national speaker and advocate for LGBTQ equality, mental health, and addiction recovery. He's the host of Rooted Recovery Stories podcast and is the National Director of Alumni at Promises Behavioral Health. He brings more than a decade of service in behavioral health and draws his passion from his personal story. After facing his own addiction in early adulthood and finding a new life in recovery, Custer has dedicated his professional career to helping others discover the freedom he has experienced through his own healing journey. And Ren Fernandez Kim is a non-binary Korean Peruvian American artist, educator, and content creator and influencer. As an individual thriving within the intersections of multiple identities, they specialize in bringing seemingly separate conversations to a unified space. Approaching the world from a both-and perspective rather than an either-or mindset has allowed them to embrace their multitude as a person and incorporate this in their everyday work. So you all can see why we're so excited to have this Pride Month conversation with the four of you. Thank you so much for joining us. It's just really wonderful. So to open up the conversation, to get started, why don't we jump in by having a very general discussion about the ways we think about our identity and about mental health and about the practices of self-compassion and love, and maybe a little bit about your own journey to self-acceptance and self-expression. I welcome anyone to go first.
I guess I'll go first.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Ren. Basically, for me, when it comes to embracing my identity and like the journey of coming to love myself and, accept who I am, especially within the mental health circle, has always come from a place of education. I think for me, having resources has been a useful tool in having answers for something that I didn't have the vocabulary to. I knew that I was non-binary since I was very young. I just didn't know what it was. And it wasn't until I started researching different cultures, different languages, and coming from a multicultural family himself, like my father is a professor of Spanish literature and colonialism. So he would tell me things like, oh yeah, we had something like this in our culture in Peru. This is what we come from. And this is like what we have there. I don't know if they have it in America, but like, this is what we have here. And in Korea, like we had something similar. And just like learning more about different cultures and being able to pull from that and learn from that and know that there was a history before pre-colonialism and know that we were always existing has been such a helpful tool for me to feel validated in my own existence. And so education has been a major part in that for me.
I love that answer. Education and history and culture.
I can hop in here too, Casey Tanner, by the way. I think that, thinking even about my own coming out journey, there was so much pressure to be 100% sure about how I identified, what language I was using. And I think a lot of that pressure came from the narrative that we often hit up against, which is that this is a phase, right? Are you really sure that's what's going on? Or, should you maybe hold off on labeling yourself? And I think in order to hold myself up through that, I was like, no, I am 100% sure. I know exactly who I am. And I think what learning to love myself over the decades since I've come out has looked like is letting go of that a little bit and saying, it's okay to not know. It's okay to shift labels. It's okay to try things on. I think we have a long history of people discriminating against us by telling us that we're experimenting. But I think that, when we're in the right circle with the right people, we actually know that experimenting is part of this, whether that's experimenting with different kinds of sex or experimenting with even different ways of expressing our queerness externally, or even getting a couple of bad tattoos and seeing how that feels, right? And like the permission to not bring the perfectionism that was so much a part of trying to pretend to be straight into the longevity of this journey.
Yeah. Great points.
Not the bad tattoos, Casey. Lord, let me not count the bad
I mean,
tattoos
for real,
I've had.
I know I'm wearing my
Listen.
palm sleeves today. Yeah.
Yeah, my kids said, "Can I get a tattoo?" I said, "Hold on, we got to figure some things out because mom has already gone down that journey, honey." Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I am Dr. LaNail Plummer. I'm the CEO of Onyx Therapy Group, and super excited to be here with you guys today. And I think I get to enjoy Mental Health America every Pride in any kind of way. I'm like, I want to do whatever we're doing, right? Like, let's do it. So, my journey, well, I officially came out, like made an official statement about it, right? About 9 years ago. And I knew when I was 7 that I was different. I didn't know what different meant. I grew up in poverty. And so people who identified as gay or lesbian, because those were the only terms we really used at that time, they were the ones who were further marginalized, right? Treated differently. And so at 7, I knew that something was different. I didn't know exactly what it was. I remember everybody singing, all my friends singing songs to their little boyfriends, and I had a girl in mind. I was like, oh, what is this happening here, right? Maybe a boy too. I identify as bisexual. But I remember being in my 30s, my early 30s, and wanting and ready to come out, but had some hesitation because I felt like I was already marginalized in so many ways. I'm Black, I'm a woman, I was a single mother, I had moved away from my family, I grew up in poverty, and I was like, if I do something else or say something else, how further out of the margins is that going to push me, right? So there was a lot of contemplation during that particular time, but I was also a practicing therapist, and I was telling clients, you have to be authentic and you need to be real and you need to be all of these things. And at one point I was like, but LaNail, is that what you're doing, right? So I decided to come out very publicly. All of my cousins and family knew already, but made a public announcement about it. And funny enough, it was my family that got the pushback, not me. Nobody came to me and said anything in particular. But my family had protected me in that way as well. So what it taught me about the process and understanding and learning and self-compassion is that we go through our own journey before we make an announcement about it, right? And it is very likely, more likely than not, that we're going to question ourselves in that journey of coming out or in that journey of acceptance, just because the society that we currently live in inundates us with messages and ideas of heterosexuality, and anything different than that is an outsider. And we don't want to be outsiders. We're humans. We want to belong, right? And so it's like we are fighting against our core beliefs and our immediate thoughts and what society says about us. And so it's like this internal struggle. Many of my clients that are in the community, we talk about their journey and their grief and their processes along the way. It's not the coming out part that's the hardest part. It's dealing with it in ourselves, which is why this conversation around self-compassion and self-respect and having boundaries is so important. Once we come out, we've done a lot of the hard work, but we need to process that hard work because we probably put ourselves through some really ringers and dingers in that process as well, right? So again, super excited to be here with you guys today.
Yeah. Those are great points. And actually, we just finished our conference, and you're reminding me of our last speaker, who was Dr. David Johns on Saturday, who was saying that he refers to himself as a same gender loving person because that's his preferred terminology, and that he has a different term for the phrase coming out, which I just love this. I'd never heard this before. Maybe you all have, which is that he said, rather than coming out, he considers it inviting in, that I have the opportunity to invite someone in, which I really loved. And part of his point was like, it's my boundary to hold, like, and I get to decide, when we invite people in and whatnot. Anyway, so thank you for that. And Patrick.
Yes. Gosh, thank you so much for asking me to be a part of that. And Dr. Plummer, I really just loved your point about, talking about that, just that piece of the coming to truth and getting vulnerable with ourselves and that identity within first, because outwardly, it doesn't matter until we've done the work inside to know ourselves and to love ourselves for who we are, and then invite someone in. For me, I grew up in the South. I live in the South. I live in Nashville, Tennessee. And I grew up in a super conservative part of town, family, Pentecostal, lots of rules, rigidity, expectations, and they did not include it okay to be gay, or anything other than, right, what you described as the rules that a lot of society requires from us and what have you. And so growing up, I thought that, based on what I had been taught, right, my everything was very spiritual for us in my family. I really thought that the feelings that I was feeling was an influence of the devil, right? And it really messed with me. So, like, for me, I experienced a lot of what I would call spiritual trauma that I've had to work through, and it took many years. It wasn't until I was 24 that I could admit to myself that I was actually gay, and that, I thought everybody was experiencing everybody had same-sex attraction that was a demonic influence. Well, come to find out, I realized, oh no, there's a spectrum and everybody's different, and I was able to own that. But it was only through, in between those years, I suffered a lot through mental health struggles, as a result, trauma, and addiction. And so it was through a number of 12-step programs, support groups, and lots of therapy that I was able to come to a place where I could find my own truth and admit it to myself first. And then I just love what you said, Dr. Wait, I think that Schroeder, I think you were talking about the person that said about inviting in, because Anne Lamott has a book called Bird by Bird, talking about the emotional acre, where we all have this space that we're born with. It just doesn't come to be. And seeds get planted there, and early on in childhood, whether it's trauma, expectations, all these things. And we at some point get to determine what we're going to uproot and what we're going to plant. And for me, I love a great metaphor. And I think about that picket fence that surrounds my emotional acre, and about the coming out process. Even still today, I am married, I'm married to a man. And here in the South, so often, I think that a lot of times I present in a way that most people could probably gather that I might be gay, outwardly. But a lot of times people don't. And so it's, people say, well, what about your wife, or this or that, or my husband's with me. And I have to break that barrier of clearly defining that I'm gay and I'm married. And being at the point where I'm healthy enough to be brave and understand, that breaking through that wall, like, I look at that as bravery. So I'm paving a path for those who are coming behind me, younger, maybe not as safe, not as strong, so that the person in front of me that may not right now be a safe person or whatever, I might open the door for them to get to know someone that they've never, actually taken time, they've never really gotten to know a gay person. There's a lot of that around here. And so there are some ways in which I open up that white picket fence for the sake of blazing a trail, knowing that it will potentially help make safety for others that come behind me. Anyway, that was a lot, but.
Oh, but I love that. I love that. And I love the spirit of that message about blazing a trail, because I think that's what we are all doing, right? Is paving a path of greater liberation for those who come after us. And I have to say, Patrick, your story really resonates with me personally. At the top, I was mentioning that I also had a gay father, and he was from the South, and he was a minister. And he when he came out, when he decided to come out in the 1969, the year of Stonewall, and I was very small toddler, And he had to leave his church, of course, and his family, who's very evangelical family from the South, loved him, but not his identity. And there was a lot of spiritual harm in that story. And so I really resonate with what you're saying. But what strikes me as really poignant is how much younger than you are than my father, and how sad that is that that's still the case. So I'm sorry that you went through that. However, I think you have quite a strength with which to blaze that trail. So let's talk about mental health and the intersection here with identity. And I also want to just go ahead and invite the complexity in your thinking, because each of you has kind of mentioned some intersectional identity issues, whether it's a proven ancestry, or growing up in poverty, or growing up in the South, or identifying as bisexual, or whatever the other ways in which the complexities and intricacies of how we identify that are all so important mixed together. So can you talk about how for you this is played out in your mental health, in your own mental health journey, and or how you think of this for the community at large, or for Dr. LaNail too? You have a therapy practice, so it might be interesting to hear from you, how you see this playing out with people that you work with.
Sure thing. I can start absolutely, and I would love to be able to tap in later on as well on the topic. But I remember for myself, I think the way I identified, because I grew up in the church too, the way I identified my trauma was more religious trauma than spiritual trauma. It was through the acceptance of who I was that my relationship with God and my ancestors got a lot closer, because I knew that that is how they had created me and purposed me to be on this earth. And so when I acknowledged the authenticity of who I was, that is when my life blossomed in ways that I had never imagined before. And I think it was because there was this spiritual call to be authentic, right? My dog has some comments and thoughts about it as well, clearly, if you hear him barking in the back. But along the journey, I absolutely remember the depression that I experienced and the anxiety that I experienced. I remember y'all looking at a girl for a tad bit too long and thinking, oh my God, everybody's gonna know right now that I was just staring at that hot girl, right? Like I would get anxious about it. There were so many memories and thoughts that I had that was affecting my mental health, to the point that at some degree, I absolutely had suicidal ideation. I absolutely questioned, what was I supposed to be doing here, and why was I given this? Now I know it's a gift for me, but why was I given this? And that confusion and that repetitive anxious thoughts and depressive identities and experiences took me to the edge. And it did. And so part of the reason, so I started the business before I came out, but when I came out is when I really took a lot of extra effort with the community. I had already had clients who were in the community, right? But I took extra effort and extra care at that particular point, because I was able to acknowledge the trauma that comes along with the journey, the amount of work we have to do to change our own cognitive thoughts and processes, the way we have to reattach with people, and in lots of situations have to create family because we've been rejected from our family or been rejected from our friends. So there's this isolation that we're experiencing right now. The Surgeon General is saying that loneliness is an epidemic in this country right now, right? And it's not uncommon to us in the community because we've been lonely, right? Like there's been points where we have been lonely and had to create family and create friends, and all of that is a lot of work that wears us out. And that is part of what makes us extra sensitive to the possibility of a mental health illness. We are just overwhelmed and tired and trying to figure it out and being ourselves and being authentic and doing this and doing that. And we find ourselves in a situation, right? So having therapists and companies and experts like those that are here today is helpful, because we can see what is about to happen and we can put somebody right underneath our wing, right? Or you all who are listening and watching can say, I feel some of those efforts, right? I feel some of that experiences. Let me reach out and get this support before it goes too far.
Yeah. I love that answer, and I find it notable in your answer that the spiritual healing in the call, or as you put it, I think the spiritual call to be your authentic self, that thing's so lovely, and that was a part for you of the journey, was really that dimension of spiritual health, which I believe is an adjacent and sometimes ignored dimension of our mental health.
Yeah, and it connects to what Ren was saying before about Korean cultural history and Peruvian cultural history.
Right.
This is not new to our being as humans, right? It is in opposition to the culture that we are currently in. But if we get in contact with our ancestors, our history, our roots, we'll find that in many cultures, we were represented then, right? But there was religion and there was economics and there was all these different factors that pushed us out to the margins. But authentically, we are who we are and who we are supposed to be and purpose to be. And when we step into that, when it's safe, everybody can't do it just the moment that they realize it, right? It's not always physically safe to do it at that time. But when it is safe, you're going to feel something you never thought you could feel before, right? Yeah.
Can we get an amen on that?
Amen. Oh my God. Yes. Thank you so much
Amen.
for that.
How about others?
Wow.
How about others?
That was so perfect. I
Yeah.
want to continue this conversation when it comes to like mental health, because I feel like so many people come up with questions like, oh, how does being in the community, the LGBTQ plus community, affect your mental health? And the honest answer to that is it does not. Me being within this community doesn't affect my mental health. The way society treats us affects my mental health. The way we are constantly under attack affects my mental health. But me just being my authentic self does not affect my mental health. Honestly, me coming into the community, being accepted by the community, has helped me actually stay here a little bit longer than I thought I would. So no, being within the community has not affected my mental health. And I want to make that absolutely clear. Also, when it comes to religious or spiritual trauma, I also have taken account, just like Dr. Plummer has said, is for me, it's the spiritual healing has been helping a lot, has just connecting with my ancestry, going back to my history, educating myself on what we are and who we could have been pre-colonization. But just kind of reconnecting with that has helped a lot. But then realizing and recognizing that religious trauma comes from just a sense of self. Like a lot of that reflection does not come from the religious text itself sometimes, right? A lot of that really just comes down to the person, the individual who's using that medium as a tool to hurt others, because it's coming from their lack of self-worth or lack of self-expression. And so for me, I used to have this huge religious hate, be like, oh, all the people who are into religion clearly do not understand, blah, blah, blah. But the thing is like, it's not so much the text itself, it's just that they are hurting themselves. They need love, they need acceptance. Maybe they are hurting and they just don't know how to handle it. And that's where they would need a lot more support. So for me, I'm trying to accept a lot of that and then make space for that healing and that hate. And hopefully that could lead to their own liberation.
Yeah. I'm so curious what an interesting story that you're telling, Ren, about connecting with ancestry and culture and history and what that's meant to you in your journey, and that your family shared with you some about the Peruvian ancestry or Korean ancestry that comes in there. Has your family been able to be supportive partners then in this journey with you?
Yes, I would like to say that both my parents have been very supportive. My mother is a little less so because she was raised incredibly Catholic, surprisingly, but she's come around to it, especially when it comes to just having open conversation, heart to heart, and then being just human with her. Because at the end of the day, even though we can pull up evidence and text and scientific research and stuff like that, at the end of the day, it comes down to, do you still love me and do you still respect me as a human being? And even regardless of whether or not you gave birth to me, do you respect me as a human being? Because I respect you as a human being, whether or not you gave birth to me. And do you believe that I deserve basic human rights? Other than that, like, if the answer is yes, then we can continue this relationship. If not, then I'm sorry, gotta go.
I love the clarity of that. We should have that. That should be a form we could distribute for the community. Casey or Patrick, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I mean, so much of what you both said has been resonating. And I love this point about being in the LGBTQI plus community isn't hurting our mental health. And I'm a clinician and I train newer clinicians. And when newer clinicians tell me that they ask this question to clients, how does being in the LGBTQI community impact your mental health? I say, well, then you better also ask your straight clients how being in the straight community is impacting their mental health, because I'll tell you that being in the straight community had a way bigger impact on my mental health than being in the queer community ever has. But yeah, I think about the first time I ever went to therapy. I was 15. I was incredibly depressed because I was, hopelessly in love with my best friend and had no idea what those feelings were. And I went to therapy, and my therapist, within one single session of sitting with me, said, this is a mother issue. You just want more from your mother. That's what this is. And, on one hand, she wasn't wrong. I have tons of mother issues, but she was so off the mark about what was happening for me in regards to my best friend. And so for, another 7 years, I didn't talk about this in therapy ever again. And I went through a severe eating disorder, my own suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, hospitalizations, had, at a certain point, 7 or 8 different diagnoses, and nobody in any of these facilities was asking me questions about my sexual orientation. It just was not coming up in intakes, or it was coming up and people didn't ask again in the years following. And so, obviously I've made an entire practice, an entire company where every single one of our staff are within the LGBTQIA plus community, not because our clients are coming in wanting to talk about their queerness every day, but simply because they don't want to have to educate their therapists. They want to have a baseline of speaking the same language. They want people who are going to ask them questions so that they don't have to be the people initiating these conversations with their therapists, like so many of us have had to do, which again, to Dr. LaNail's point, is a burden placed on our community that, especially in the context of therapy, the therapist should be carrying.
Yeah. I love the flip in this conversation around where the burden is in terms of what people feel around at the mental health and identity intersection. And your story, Casey, has some awfully pointed notes for those of us in the mental health field that we really need to pay attention to. That one interaction caused you to pause for 7 years, which had a lot of difficulty in them. So, the first time we hear something from someone, that is a precious moment, and one that we have to meet with all the right cultural responsiveness that we possibly can. And even then going forward, in every encounter, therapeutic encounter, it's really important to be there with compassion. And I find also not just to read off of forms, not just to do an intake and ask people to identify themselves demographically, but then to be open and curious and accepting about what that means to them and bring it up again in conversation.
Right. And I think sometimes we think, asking this question, what is your sexual orientation, is going to get us somewhere with somebody. First of all, they might not even know what that term means. Are they going to really disclose to you when you are essentially a stranger to them in that first session, right? Like, we think that question is going to get us the answer that we need. And I think part of this is actually just being more creative as clinicians as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. How about you, Patrick? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, so I'm going to go backwards just a little bit, because y'all hit on something really interesting that I feel like this is relative. Recently, so I do a lot in the podcast world. And I was asked for an interview recently to talk about during Pride Month, to speak to the older generations that may or may not be, or that aren't in a place of being safe, understanding, all those things. and how they can do better, right? And I took it and I sat back and I went, I don't feel like I can do that. While I'm gonna make this disclaimer, like I have no idea what it, like I sit in a place of many areas of privilege, just existing the way that I are with the way that I do, and I understand that. But as much as I can look at it and watch what I've had to do, my own, like look at my own racial bias, different things that may or may not be there, I said that this feels like something, you know, I'm willing to speak on a topic, but this feels like something on the verge of asking a Black person to teach them how not to be racist or how to dismantle their own racial bias. And I believe that is everybody's individual work.
Yeah.
And so for me, I think that along the same lines of what, you know, we're doing these panels and everything that are really great. And I think we're speaking more towards like our own community, what have you, and not teaching necessarily people how to be allies. But I don't know. I felt like that was kind of in line with saying, if you're part of this community or you feel like you're part of this community, I don't think, and this is just my own belief, I don't think we should ever feel like it's our responsibility to educate other people on how not to be bigoted.
Yeah.
It's their own, you know, their own work and their own education to do. And so, and then I'll move back to I love Dr. Plummer. Thank you for saying what you did about the spiritual thing. For me, and I think we all have this theme that is so connected there. And I think a lot of us probably do. Everybody, you know, a lot of us on the call, up until a certain point, that was what I understood as spirituality, right? And then I got to a place because I was so sick that I ended up having to go to treatment, and then got into 12-step communities where we had to do inventories, right? And 12 steps, there are some really good, and this is where I would recommend to people, support groups are so great. National NAMI groups and Emotions Anonymous, even if you don't struggle with addiction, there's 12-step groups for everybody. The addiction support groups, if you do struggle with one of them, the possibility of bringing about healing, I believe so much, so wholeheartedly, and they worked for me. So that's why I'm sharing that. And the process around what I worked through allowed me to get to a place to even get to the mental health piece, right? Because I was in such a world where the religious, which I didn't know yet, and you're so right on there's the religious and there's the spiritual. I had been bound by the religious and the religious trauma and the rigidity of those rules that I couldn't even get past that until I took the identity of religion and God that I had inherited and disinherited it, and started down a path inventorying who a higher power was to me. How has a higher power shown up in my life? And being granted that liberty, that freedom to do that, paved the way for me to be able to accept myself, my sexuality, my existence on this earth, the fact that I have all these other things, my mind, will, and emotions that get to have a play. Like everything isn't just on a spiritual plane. And that's the world I grew up in. Everything was spiritual. And so if anybody out there is like, can understand, like, it was like this portal I had to get through where I took this cloak off. And then I had all this freedom and the world opened up to me, right? And to really become accepting of just like everybody else in their own connection spiritually to how they identify. I had always been held back by that. And so I don't know, I would say that like that for me, that's the biggest thing that I want to speak on as it relates to this. I had to take the cloak off. I had to take off the religious trauma and come to a new understanding and identity spiritually, before I could even get to that place to work through the mental health process. And my tools were therapy and 12 steps.
Yeah. I really love that the imagery of that analogy of taking the cloak off and walking through a portal that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, it's to me, it sounds like language about personal transformation, and that you were moving from one state to another state, and the state that you were in before, when that cloak that was really an enclosure that was keeping you held in that religious identity that didn't allow for your authentic identity to come out, needed, to find this new home and to find a new way of constructing your own sense of spiritual well-being and health. And that's really lovely. I love the way you told that. And you also took us, Patrick, so maybe we'll sort of like veer into this now, and if you all take the conversation where you want. I'm not sure where we plan to go next, but it feels like where we're headed. When you were talking, Patrick, at the beginning of what you just said about declining to do the podcast, where you felt uncomfortable with that, one thing that interested me about that story is, in part, what you're saying is you're setting a boundary for yourself. That doesn't feel right, and I think that's something so important for that we all have to learn how to do in this, in living in our true authentic identity, and in the process of inviting in, coming out, etc. But part of where else my mind went when you were telling that was that doing something like that today, being asked to talk with folks who may not be supportive and help to be the bridge to them to come to some greater understanding, acceptance, or awareness around LGBTQ issues and people, that doesn't feel so safe in 2023 necessarily, too. It's a different proposition than it was even a year ago. So I wonder if we could maybe sort of turn to talk a little bit about the times and how you see them. And you all are of I think, in younger generation than I am, and I know I'm really feeling deep concern around this time. Anyway, I'd be very curious to hear what you think about it, what you're observing, what your conversations with friends are revealing, or clients, etc.
Two things are coming to mind. One is, I think a lot of us are trained to hear clients when they catastrophize, or when they talk about feeling unsafe, for us to sort of, challenge some of those thoughts and help them see, help them get into wise mind and see what parts of those may be logical and what parts are emotional. But when it comes to the state of safety for queer and trans folks, especially Black, Indigenous, and POC queer and trans folks, none of this is catastrophization. None of this is illogical. These are not thoughts that need to be challenged. This is a reality of our clients' world. And I think a unique position for us as therapists to be, it in some ways reminds me of being a therapist during COVID, where we were in this time of going through exactly what our clients were going through and still having to play that like healing, supportive role for them. I think that's sometimes what it feels like to be a queer non-binary therapist during this current political landscape. I think too, like I am both a therapist and an activist. And I think, earlier on in my career, I felt like I had to be both of those things constantly all the time, and then ran into such immense burnout. And it's tough, but getting to a place where I realized, like, you cannot fight every battle. You cannot read every news article. I cannot, be a therapist from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and an activist from 6 p.m. to midnight, which is something that I did do for many years. And like letting go of like any idea of being a martyr, and choosing, okay, where am I really going to focus my energy to make an impact that allows me to do this with longevity and sustainability. And that's what I talk to my clients about too, right? There's research, there's staying appraised of what's going on, there's doing activist work. And then I think there's sometimes doing it to the point where it puts us into a state of freeze, where we can actually mobilize and do what needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. That's such an interesting point, speaking to a really important issue of activism and maintaining our own well-being. And yeah, good point.
I wanted to continue that conversation
Yeah.
of activism, mostly because I know for me, my mental health, I do live with depression, and something that I've had to do as of like the past few years or so, especially with dealing with the multiple intersectional identities that I live in, and living in a world that has to recognize intersectionalities that exist, the complexities that exist. I had to start defining my depression and realizing, is this depression or is this oppression? Is this what I'm feeling a result of my own like consequences that I'm dealing with, or the things that I'm working with, or is it something that I am living with because I'm currently being oppressed by a system that is existing and is not supposed to support me, and that's why I'm feeling this way. So really realizing and recognizing what that is and pinpointing that and recognizing that work is really helpful for someone who's dealing with a lot of mental health issues, and figuring out, no, it's not your fault. Whatever it is that you're dealing with, whatever this is right now, it's not your fault. And that helps me a lot in moments where I'm in my deepest lows.
Yeah.
So I just need to bring that wherever who needs it right now.
I think you're making such an important point, Ren, about normalizing the stress that people are feeling and being able to recognize. I love the way you said it, depression or oppression. And that's, sort of figuring out that, yeah, circumstances are real. This is real, and it does have a real effect on us. And we need to be aware of that. Yeah.
I'm thinking about this from the question of like, what does it feel like now? And in comparison, right? So I was thinking about some of the older generations that grew up, and there was not a lot of LGBTQ representation on TV, in books, in magazines, anything like that. So it was far more isolating than what some of our youth is experiencing now, where it's still not a full representation, but they might likely see somebody that looks like them, somebody who represents them. I just ended my professorship at Johns Hopkins University, and my students would often come to me and say, I am just appreciative of the fact that you identify openly as bisexual. That makes me feel seen in ways that I have never been seen before, or understood in ways that I've never stood before. I promise you, in all of my years of education, I had not ever had a professor that was queer, me personally, right? And so they are growing up with a different level of representation. So the attacks that we are all experiencing collectively as a community means something different to every generation. And so just like all Black people are not monolithic, all people in the LGBTQ community aren't monolithic. So to one of your previous questions about the intersections of race, or the intersections of gender, or the intersections of social economic status, all of those intersections, along with being an LGBTQ identifying person, matters differently. These attacks matter differently. When an attack happens on a civil right, it means different to me as a bisexual married mother than it may mean to somebody else. Because if something happens to me as a mother, that is going to affect the generations that come behind, right? So I think it's important that while we are taking up space, the space that we deserve to have as an LGBTQ community, we have to also, within the community, give space for these intersections, right? Some people need to, just like Casey talked about before, and I 100% believe, clients come to therapists and they don't want to explain everything. Sometimes people in the community don't want to have to explain themselves to other people in the community. I don't want to always have to explain what it means to be bisexual to somebody who's gay or somebody who's lesbian, because they don't necessarily understand or support or believe in what bisexuality is, right? And what it means. And that is controversial in itself, right? Us bees, we got a whole thing that we dealing with the straights and the gays. We got a whole bunch of things we dealing with, right? And so there's a lot that goes in there. So what I think about in all of this is how we are protecting ourselves emotionally. And Casey hit on it a little bit too, in terms of, you don't have to watch everything. You don't have to go everywhere. You don't have to explain everything. Like, you can absolutely say no. We did a lot of the hard work in already coming out, and it took so much courage and bravery and intentionality to be authentic. And we equally have to be authentic with our feelings, right? We equally have to let our feelings come out. We equally have to express our feelings. We equally have to protect ourselves. We equally have to have boundaries around what we want to see, what we want to experience. The information that we need, it's going to find a way to come to us. We don't always have to search for it, especially if we're in a state of trying to protect ourselves in those moments. So I guess my major points is understand that it's different for culture, for the different generational cultures. Understand intersectionality as it pertains here. Give yourself space to say no, you don't want to do something, and that's fine. And not just come out with your identity, but come out with your emotions and your expressions and what is true and authentic for you in all areas of your life, not just your sexual orientation.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, great. Patrick, did you want to add anything to this?
So good. I feel like I can't go after Dr. Plummer. Bring in church. I mean, like, gosh, not to trigger anybody by saying that, but like for me, that's like, I just
We're having a queer
felt
church.
all kinds of things. Yeah. So this is safe church. Yeah. So gosh, I will say around my own experience, like speaking to the activism part, I think that we all have to take a good look at like what can we and are we willing to do safely to show up as an activist, because I think that, like, there are some people that would say I am an activist, but being part of a community like ours, in some way, shape, or form, there are micro ways we show up as activists, and there are big ways that we can show, right? So it's not just like this black or white. I think that, to me, there's a grand scale, and we have to, I take a look at regularly of what I can do. And for me, that really started with, but personally, I had to go through this whole process of, we were talking about identity, I had to go through this whole process of dealing with my own internalized homophobia, break through all of that, realizing that, like, y'all, I had two different voices, and my friends confronted me about it. They were like, if you're talking to straight people, you sound like a bro. And when you're talking to people you feel safe around, you sound a lot more feminine. And all these things. And it took a lot of work for me to get to a place where I was safe enough that my identities started to merge to where I was the same person. But I also know, and I would say that, like, there's safety there. Like, I had to get to a place where I knew that I could be myself wherever the spaces that I was going. And so not everybody can do that. Not everybody can be that. But that was where it started for me, is for myself, coming to that authenticity and having congruency between, what was the real me on the inside, what I was showing on the outside. And then the activism piece is, and it also just follows along the lines of being what I would call a good and responsible person, part of the LGBTQ plus community. I am a cis white gay male. I mean, like, I'm this far when it comes to being discriminated against, like, I might as well be straight. I'll just be honest. You know what I mean? Like, the majority of the rest of the LGBTQ plus community is much more marginalized and discriminated against than the place that I sit in. And so for me, taking inventory of that and realizing I've got to look at and educate myself on what is the whole rest of this world of the LGBTQ plus, because it didn't come with a manual when I came out, especially in the South. And so, just like I said before, I didn't want to teach, and I didn't feel like it was my place to teach these older generations of how not to be bigoted. I also have taken ownership and am still doing my own work on learning more about the trans, but the BIPOC, all the things, and how I can support, how I can show up. And that's like an ongoing process. I don't think that will ever end for me. In our lifetime, everybody who's part of this call right now, I think we're going to be going through an ever developing evolution of identifying and finding ways that we can be caring and compassionate and show up for the other people in our community, being supportive and be supportive. And so I don't know, I guess that's what I would say. And I kind of want to close out with my last thought on that piece of saying, again, when and where I can show up and physically be a body and a presence that says, I either support you or I am like you and I'm here. The most recent example is a Pride Festival that's in the county where I grew up that I would have never, it's a newer one. They haven't had it they've only had it for 3 years. But it was very, it was on national news because the aldermen of the town almost voted it down. They weren't going to let Pride happen, which is crazy to think, right? Like, you can't do that. What? And I realized, I look back and I go, we live in a suburb. I grew up in a suburb of Nashville, very close to Nashville, but still, I was a kid in that community, and I did not see, or I never saw an openly gay person until I was like a middle teenager. Mind you, I was homeschooled my whole life, which was kind of why, but still, I had no representation to look at and attach myself to. And so I just went to this Pride Festival because I was like, I want another body there to show up and be present to this small little festival and make sure that if there are kids there, there are teenagers that are confused and may not feel loved, may not feel like there's any support in this county that is still very, very bigoted and conservative, that they know that there are, they see that. And so that's where I'm really seeing how I can show up to be present and serve in community for my fellows.
I love that, Patrick. I'm so glad you went to that. And for any child or young person who saw you there, that's a gift, and it's a really important one. And I also really love the way you pointed to the evolution, our ongoing evolution to become a more inclusive and compassionate community. May it be so. What a fantastic conversation. You all are wonderful. You're awesome. This was so fun. Happy Pride to all of you. Happy Pride to our audience. And we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.